Anonymous no more. Donor conception and direct-to-consumer DNA testing. I'm Sarah Norcross and I'm the Director of Progress Educational Trust, or PET as we like to call ourselves. And for those of you who are new to our work, PET is a charity that aims to improve choices for people who are affected by infertility and genetic conditions. And we're delighted to be working this evening with the University of Liverpool in London. And we're also incredibly grateful to the London Women's Clinic and the European Sperm Bank. So without further ado now, I'm going to hand over to our first speaker this evening, and that's Debbie Kennett, who's a genetic genealogist and honorary research associate at University College London. She's going to set the scene about these genetic tests because it can be quite complicated. So over to you, Debbie.
We now have not 3 million people tested, but over 30 million people tested around the world. In the UK alone, it's estimated that over 4 million people have taken a DNA test. And that has essentially transformed the landscape, and we are now at a stage where donor anonymity is essentially a thing of the past. If anyone is trying to be anonymous, it's only a matter of time before they are exposed. For those of you who haven't taken a DNA test, this is the sort of thing that you would get. And the test is composed of two different parts. So the advertising tends to focus on that you take a DNA test to find out who you are and where you're from. And what you get for that is one of these, it's called a biogeographical ancestry estimate, which gives you percentages of DNA from different parts of the world. But the other part of the test, which is the bit that is really exposing anonymity, is the cousin matching part. So you go into a database, and this is an opt-in process, and you are matched with your genetic relatives. And it's usually the father that is not the person's biological father. Now, the relative matching works on just some very basic principles of biology. We know that we get 50% of our DNA from each of our parents, and we get on average 25% of our DNA from each of our grandparents. But it can vary quite considerably around those averages. And then as we go back through the generations, we get 12.5% on average from our great-grandparents and around 6.25% from our great-great-grandparents. The companies can look at the amount of DNA shared between two people in the database, and they can make predictions based on the amount of DNA shared, the number of segments shared, about what your relationship is with that person. If you share 50% of your DNA, then you must either be matching a parent or you must be matching a full sibling. And there are ways of looking at the DNA and working out which of those relationships it is. If you share 25% of your DNA, there's a wider possible range of relationships. It could be a grandparent-grandchild relationship. It could be what's called a nibbling relationship, an uncle and nephew. Or it could be half-siblings, or it could be double first cousins, where two sisters married two brothers and then had children. DNA is never used on its own. You always need the context, you always need the genealogical information to try and work out what the relationship is. So sometimes just age alone will help you to determine what the relationship is. And as you go further back in time, and as you share less and less DNA, there's a much wider range of possible relationships. But if you're trying to identify someone, all you really need is something like a second cousin match. That's really the sweet spot where identification is fairly straightforward. If you match with a second cousin, you know you share great-grandparents, and you've only got 4 sets of great-grandparents. So it doesn't take that much work to actually work down the family tree and identify which line that's from. And that also becomes easier when you look and see which matches you share in common with your second cousin. So a consequence of this growth in direct-to-consumer testing is that donor-conceived individuals can now take a DNA test to search for their biological parent or parents, and they have a very good chance now of finding who that parent was. And donors can also take a consumer DNA test to find out, to try and connect with their offspring. And a lot of donors do actually want to connect with their offspring. Some of them are actually out there with open Facebook pages ready to welcome their offspring. The recipient parents can also test their child to identify the donor and also their child's half-siblings. Now, the donor does not have to be in the database to be identified. A donor can be identified through his close relatives or through his third or fourth cousin sometimes. And also the donor-conceived person does not need to be in the database. So if someone is donor-conceived, if they have a child, that child takes a DNA test. The mother doesn't know she's donor-conceived, but that secret comes out through the child's DNA test. And we've had a number of cases where that's happened. So, of course, donor conception in the UK has been going on since 1940. And all of those people were promised anonymity, and the parents were told not to tell the children on medical advice. And I think that's the generation that's going to be most affected by this. Some of the companies are now getting so many people ringing them up, confused about their DNA results and why they don't match the people they should match and why they've got unexpected children they knew nothing about, that they've had to train their customer support representatives. And in the UK, we've got the Donor Conception Network, who can provide support and advice. And something that a lady called Brianne Kirkpatrick in America offers a genetic counselling service, and I think this is something that we really need to have more of in the UK. And the other thing that we are finding is that the families who went for infertility treatment and they thought that the father's sperm had been used, they are now discovering that the father's sperm was not used and the doctor substituted his own sperm. And we've had a large number of cases like this. And there's now even a new crime in America called fertility fraud. In Texas, they've introduced a similar law, and you could be put in prison for between 6 months to 2 years. And they have classified fertility fraud on a par with sexual assault and rape. And the numbers affected are now getting really big. The maximum number that we know of at the moment is 189 donors born to one doctor, but there's certainly a couple of groups with over 100. And we also have an explosion of men advertising their services online. And this one man claims to have fathered 800 children. He's selling his sperm £50 a time. He's made £40,000, and he wants to carry on until he has 1,000. So, just to sum up, DNA now means that donors are not anonymous. We now have to decide whose responsibility it is to provide support and counselling for all the parties affected. So it's the donors, it's the donor-conceived, it's the families, and perhaps even the doctors who were making these decisions in the first place, who now realise that what they were doing was perhaps not right. And how do we protect and respect the privacy and wishes of all the parties involved and their family members? Some people want to go out and tell the world, others still want to keep it a secret. So how do you try and reconcile all these differences in outlook? And what are the responsibilities of the fertility sector to inform the donors and the parents, and also retrospectively to inform their former clients? Is there a need for changes in existing legislation? So should something like selling sperm be made illegal? And should we perhaps remove donor anonymity altogether, rather than expecting a child to wait until they're 18, because the secret can come out at any time anyway? And is it perhaps time for some sort of new paradigm of donor conception, so that we have there's some families who are looking at things like who are practicing co-parenting, who are open with the child from the outset and actually involve the biological father in the parenting arrangement? I think it's really time for a much wider debate throughout society to try and decide how we cope with the end of donor anonymity.
Thank you so much, Debbie, for setting the scene so well. And our next speaker this evening is Andy Waters. And Andy was a sperm donor in the UK before the law changed to end anonymity.
I was a sperm donor between 1986 and 1990. I am one of those people who has found some of my donor conceived via Ancestry. I think one of the other sides we need to talk about is the disclosure of the fact that people are donor conceived, because in a world where we can no longer hide it, then it's time to start telling the truth. It is actually something that has the capability of being utterly life enriching. If you are somebody, I should explain a little bit of background. I'm on the donor conceived register, which is a site set up for those pre-1992, where donors who are willing to to be found can put their DNA, and donor conceived from before them can also put their DNA, and it's the only means left for those conceived before those dates to find each other. So I've been blessed to meet hundreds of donor conceived who are very desperate to find their donor. And finally, they have a tool. And I'm hearing so many stories, almost universally good stories, about people who, if they're not finding their donors because their donors have died, are certainly finding their half-siblings. And I have yet to hear a story where finding your half-siblings has not turned out to be a positive and life-enriching experience. So I don't think it is something to be afraid of. But what I do think we need to do is to fix the honesty bit. If we're going to talk about the things that we as a society need to look at, it is time to acknowledge that it is time to tell. Now, there have been previous discussions before about should we be putting it on birth certificates, or should we be following the model that there is with adoption of disclosing at 18. But it is time for the state to involve itself in this and give a nudge for parents to tell their offspring, because if they don't, Ancestry will. And when they do find out this way, and then finding out is a matter of discovering that your parents have essentially lied to you about the most fundamental aspect of your being for your entire life, the only reaction that tends to provoke is anger and distress and hurt. And that's the bit we need to be looking at and fixing. And it is time to review the decisions that the state has made, that it's not going to go down the path about populating birth certificates or telling people at 18. It's time to look at those again.
So our next speaker is Becky, who is a donor-conceived person.
So when I was born in 1963, only 4 people knew that I'd been conceived using donor insemination. My parents, the doctor who treated them, and the sperm donor. Only 2 people knew the identity of my biological father, my parents' doctor, and the donor himself. And my parents, as all parents were then, were told to keep it a secret for my sake, that it would be too distressing for me to know. Fast forward 37 years to 2000, so we're talking before all of this explosion of consumer testing. And my mother broke her promise, finally. So I was 37, and she told me this secret. It's like an earthquake, is how I've started describing it. It's like the whole ground beneath your feet is just taken away. Everything changes. Everything looks different. The aftershocks go on for many years, in my experience. And it's the most extraordinary sort of catalogue of losses. So the loss of the father you thought was your father, the loss of the full brother who no longer is a full brother, the loss of your cousins, your aunts, your uncles, the loss of all the stories that were told to you as a child that now are not, you realise are not right. But it is a tremendous shock. What I found very, very quickly that first night was a documentary maker in Canada who'd made a film about searching for his donor, and he had been conceived at the same clinic as me. So I contacted him. He had already made contact with, I think it was 6 others who had been conceived at that clinic, and gradually we all got in touch with each other, and we became this little group of people who really formed quite a close bond. There were probably about 9 of us, I think, in that initial group, and it turned out that 6 of those 9 were half-siblings. So suddenly, they were my brothers and sisters. We were sort of elated. I mean, it was extraordinary. It was really fantastic. But at the same test, we also found out who our donor was, because one of the people in the group was his son. So his actual son, who he raised, was also one of our half-siblings. So therefore, we had found the donor, who was dead by that point, so we didn't get to meet him. But through his son, we learnt a lot about him. I quite quickly came to regard them as family. Then we went into a next phase, which is the Ancestry.com phase, where in the past 3 years or so, this family group has grown. There are now 31 of us. Of the recent additions, 15 have come through commercial testing. And of that 15, 13 didn't know they were donor conceived when they were tested. Some of them were very devastated, some of them not so much, some of them seem to take it in their stride more, but I think it's definitely true that all of them have been very disturbed by it. These are men and women in their 50s and older who are now having to completely rewrite their own story, as I did in my 30s. It's not an easy thing to do. What I want to emphasise, though, in a way, is that finding people is just the start of it. It raises immediately all of these ethical issues. You know, how do you approach someone who, when you know they're your half-sibling? How do you approach someone if you think they might be your donor? What do you say in the letter? You know, you write to them. What do you say in it? What do you say when you find a grandmother and you find out that she's only got 6 months to live? And do you tell her at that point, or what? I mean, these are real stories I'm telling you here. What if you have a half-sibling who doesn't want to approach the donor, but you do? You know, you can't unknow that. Your half-sibling can't not know it if you know it. You know, the ramifications just go on and on and on. I don't think that commercial DNA testing has really changed anything substantive. It's not. What it's done, though, is it's shifted the balance of power away from an industry and away from those parents who would rather not tell, and towards the offspring who, like it or not, will find out at some point. And the final thing is that it's a basic right to know your own history, I think, and that I would agree. I think we've got to the point where birth certificates are the way forward.
Our next speaker is Louise Johnson, and Louise is the Chief Executive of the Victorian Assisted Reproduction Treatment Authority in Australia.
To start with, I'd like to talk about anonymity versus identity release and the reality of that. And in 1984, Victoria and Sweden passed the first legislation to enable donor-conceived people to apply for identifying information about their donor. And in 2016, the Victorian Parliament took the brave step of abolishing anonymity for everybody. The Victorian government said that donor-conceived people could have the right to identifying information about their donor regardless of when they were born. For donors who'd been anonymous for all of these years, they would be no longer anonymous. But they could choose whether they wanted to have contact or not, and could express a no contact preference if they wished. So Victoria's opened the doors in Australia. We have a voluntary register where people can be linked via donor codes, so parents can link up with other parents who've used the same donor, and parents have formed friendship groups with the donor and other parents, and they meet regularly, for example. But parents can also apply for information about the donor on behalf of younger children. And many parents are doing that, and they're inviting the donor to be involved in the child's life. Donors can also apply for information, and this is something that is quite unusual. And if the donor applies for information, then we're required to seek consent from either the parent of a young child or a donor-conceived adult to see what they want to do, whether they want to exchange information or use our services to exchange information via a letterbox system, or have a facilitated meeting, or have no contact at all. So there's a variety of wishes. We're referring donor-conceived people to a group of donor detectives who've become expert at helping others to find their relatives via Ancestry.com or other DNA testing services. And we try and connect people in with our services as well, because it can be a bit scary making an approach to somebody that you don't know is going to either welcome you or reject you or be totally puzzled. It's a bit scary, like a blind date, only much worse than that. So issues for consumers that we're finding: that results are unexpected, overwhelming, interpreting results can be complex, there's a lack of support, and there's concern about being scammed, and the volume of matches can be totally overwhelming. Support is definitely needed for people who are receiving shock genetic discoveries. Laws are slow to catch up with this new reality, and there's a strong belief in Victoria that's legislated now that donor-conceived people have a right to know their biological history. And we're encouraging families to be open with children conceived with the assistance of donor gametes.
Now is the time when we kick over to you guys for your questions.
Debbie, you mentioned in one of your slides that one fathered 600 born children, the other one fathered 800. And I assume most of them are in the same city, just moving around. They might not even know they are from donor sperm. So what is the possibility for a sibling male to meet a sibling female and to produce children? And ethically and from the genetic, disorders, all other issues.
It has happened, and it will continue to happen. There was a case recently, a Reddit thread where two people were dating, and they both took a 23andMe test, opened up their results, and found there they were a match, half siblings. But there's a phenomenon called genetic sexual attraction, which is known from the adoption community, and if people didn't grow up with their family, you're attracted to people who are like you. So there's actually more of a chance of being attracted to a half sibling if you happen to meet them by chance. I think is a compelling reason for ensuring that everyone knows that they are donor conceived. But we've got no way of reaching these people, because a lot of these cases go back to the 1940s, 1950s, and the children weren't told, the parents didn't tell.
You can go on these DNA testing sites and find your donor, then presumably you don't have to wait until the child's aged 18 to do so. And I know in Australia it's possible to find or at least contact the donor before the age of 18. I just wondered what people kind of thought about that, and whether or not that's something that needs to be discussed.
In Victoria and Australia is the only state in Australia where parents can apply for information on behalf of younger children, so that's quite unusual worldwide. But I see it as one of the most positive things about the system in Victoria, that parents can be empowered to apply for information and provide information as their children become curious and want more and more information. And I think the voice of parents is also important, because many parents have fears about losing the love of their children if they tell them that they're donor conceived. Particularly the male in the partnership can have greater fears as well if they've used a sperm donor too. So it's important to support parents in relation to those sorts of fears, so that they can tell their children with greater confidence.
We're seeing lots of parents, the mothers quite often seem to want to test the child to find out more about the father, and if they're doing that when the child is 5 or 6 or 7, why have you got a system of identity release? And also, why are we discriminating against one portion of the population and denying them access to information about their biological father, expecting them to wait until they're age 18? It just doesn't seem fair to me to discriminate against a sector of the population in such a way. I think the law should be changed so that donor anonymity is, it's declared on the birth certificate, and that the family have the right to know right from the outset. It seems to be, I can't see any other way forwards.
The issue is consent. If I choose to be found through the donor conceived registry because I choose to register it and be on it, if I get found, as indeed I did, through ancestry and I did not consent to that, it's not an appropriate vehicle for identity release to me.
The only other things I have to do now are to thank Lucy and the University of Liverpool here in London, and London Women's Clinic and the European Sperm Bank for their additional support in this that's helped pay for the filming. So I'm going to hand over to Lucy to close the event for this evening.
I think there's several key issues, that come up for me, but the broad topic is something that hasn't been resolved, and there's still a huge variance of opinion about this, which I think is fascinating, both from an academic perspective, but also in terms of how people are managing their families in reality. With the European Society of Human Reproduction and Embryology, I'm involved in writing some good practice guidelines, or beginning to think about good practice guidelines in this area. So I think there's still a lot of work to do to build on the excellent work already done. And I also think there's issues about how we manage support and how we do that in an environment with decreasing resources for any kind of emotional and psychological support, certainly in the UK, that's provided on the NHS. So I think there's a lot of challenges, but also I think a lot of
good work being done by organisations like VARTA and the HFEA to take these debates forward. So I'd like to thank our panel again, because I think it was a fantastic evening and really, really interesting. And Sarah and her team, her wonderful team.